7 o'clock, time for us to start. As we mentioned last week, Sam, of course, is out of town for a couple of weeks. So I was covering for him last week to finish up the series on one another obligations of the New Testament. And then tonight it's supposed to start a new quarter. However, we figured it would be best if I just kind of extend his study of the one another duties for an extra week, and then he can start fresh in the book of Ecclesiastes next Wednesday night. So you have that to look forward to when he gets back. Last week we were looking at the one another obligations that we have. This is just a quick review of what he has covered over the preceding 3 months of what the New Testament teaches about how we are to treat one another as the people of God. But then the thing that we were focusing on last week was that there are impacts or influences of these one another duties. If we're doing our job as we're supposed to, it's going to have an impact in two directions. One is internally. We talked about that last week. And we'll just quickly review that here in a moment. And then tonight's lesson is going to be on the external impacts. How us treating one another like we're supposed to is going to affect our influence on the world around us. We don't normally think of it in those terms. One another duties are, by definition, constrained to just one another, how we treat one another. But actually, it has a ripple effect out in the community, out in the world around us. And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. Before we get started in tonight's lesson, though, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father, we're so very thankful for a beautiful fall day that you've given us. We're grateful that we live in a land that affords us the opportunity to come together to study and discuss your word as we're doing this evening. Pray, Father, that you'd be with us in this period of study, that we will have our hearts open to recognize the truth that can both transform our lives and allow us to have a greater influence on the lives of those around us. We pray that you might be with those who could not be with us this evening, especially those who are traveling. Watch over them and bring them safely back to us. Give us a peaceful night of rest this evening and guide us through the remainder of our lives as we strive to walk in the steps of your Son, Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. Last week we talked about the internal influence or impact of these one another obligations. If we're doing the job that we're supposed to, it's going to impact us personally. Personally, we're each going to grow. Think of it as a petri dish in which the environment is conducive to growth. And we are existing in that dish and feeding on the encouragement, the strength, and so forth that we get from this special relationship that we have. And speaking of relationships, it's going to impact our relationship health. Those of us who are in constant contact with one another, our relationships are going to be deepened and strengthened and made stronger by fulfilling these responsibilities that we have to one another. And then we also spent time talking about the group cohesion. Group cohesion being our ability to work together as a team, to accomplish a purpose, an objective, a mission that we have as a group. Is going to be enhanced by the way that we treat one another. When you have a group that is dysfunctional, there's bickering, there's conflict, what is that group going to accomplish long term? Nothing. Yeah, they're too busy fighting each other to accomplish the group's purpose or mission. So group cohesion, our ability to function as a unit, as a team, is obviously impacted by our ability to fulfill these one another obligations. Now, last week we ended on this chart right here. We were looking at the early Jerusalem church in Acts 2. All who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God. We highlighted those terms there that describe the closeness of spirit that existed among this early group. They had a unity, a bond among them that was pretty unusual in that day and time. But what really sets up tonight's lesson is the last line there in verse 47, and having favor with all the people. You see the switch that Luke makes here in his description of what's going on? In the verses preceding, he's talking about the condition that exists among the people themselves, these early Christians. And it was a very positive, wholesome, fulfilling relationship that they had with one another. But then that last line of verse 47, he shifts gears and he points his attention out here to the community, to the world, that these early Christians were having favor with all the people. And that's significant because that really sets up what we're going to talk about this evening. It isn't just the fact that these people had a unique relationship among themselves, which they did, but that relationship that they had with one another then had an impact in their community. They had favor with all the people around them. Outsiders could look in on this group of these early Christians and they'd say, there's something different about these people. We don't know what it is. We don't know what explains it, but there's something about these people that we've not seen before. And so if nothing else, that last line there in verse 47 triggers a curiosity factor among the outsiders. They want to know, why are these Christians now, why are they so different? And as you read on through the rest of the book of Acts, you see this same theme play out several times. Look in chapter 4, verse 32, describing the internal dynamics of the group. Now the multitude of those who believed, these early Christians, were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. Here again is another description of this special relationship that these early Christians had with one another. But skip down a few verses into chapter 5. We're told the people esteemed them highly, and believers were increasingly added to the Lord. Earlier in chapter 2, we're told that the people looked upon these Christians with favor. They had favor among the people, the outsiders. And now we're told that these people, the outsiders, esteemed them, the Christians, highly, and believers were increasingly added to the Lord. So what is this external influence that the Christians are having on their community? How's it affecting their evangelism? These early Christians were attractive in some respect, not physically probably, but communally. They constituted a community of people of like faith that was just infectious. And as the people around them saw what was happening inside the church, these outsiders were saying, I wish I had what you have. There's something about these people and how they're getting along with one another that we've never seen before. There's something positive, there's something attractive about these Christians, these disciples of Jesus, and we want that. Now, so that's what we see in the early church in Jerusalem. But actually, if you go back in time and you look at what Jesus taught, Jesus anticipated this. This was, in fact, part of his plan. that if his disciples fulfilled what he wanted them to fulfill, that this was precisely the outcome that they were going to see. Go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Early in that sermon, Jesus says, you, speaking of his disciples, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Now notice that last sentence. Let your light shine before men. What is the light? Actually, the rest of the sentence answers that question. What does it mean to let your light shine? Well, yeah, they'll see the glory of God, but what is it in these people? Through their works, yeah. They may see your good works and glorify your Father. Frank? Was that it? Okay. Yeah, so as we're living out our good works, the kind of life that God wants us to live, and a big part of that is how we relate to one another as disciples of Jesus, people on the outside are going to look at that and they'll say, wow, people really can get along with one another. People don't have to live in a world of constant fighting and bickering and squabbling and beating up on one another. And here you've got this group of people who have figured out how to do it. And that, Jesus says, glorifies our Father in heaven by what they're seeing in the life that you live, the works that you are displaying. That's letting your light shine before men. Now, don't have a chart for this, but if you're familiar with what follows this section here in Matthew chapter 5, what does then, from that point through the rest of chapter 5, is Jesus describing? Just kind of summarize the rest of what he says. And I'll give you a little hint. It's this formula that he uses again and again in the rest of this chapter. You have heard it said, but I say to you. So what is this I say to you content that he teaches in the rest of the chapter? For example, what... Go ahead. That's true. What is it that he says, though? What are the details? Well, that's what we're trying to tease out here. For example, you've heard that it said, you shall not commit murder. Okay. But Jesus carries it a step further. What does he insist upon? I think I know what you're trying to say here. It's not enough just to, I'm sorry? Don't even get angry. Don't let your anger boil over. You tackle the inclination to murder somebody in the heart. You need to control the anger in your heart. What does he say about marriage? What kind of attitude did the typical Jewish men of that day have about marriage? For example, divorce. Yeah, it was no big deal. If she burns the biscuits, just dump her and get a newer, later, more beautiful model. And, as long as the paperwork is in order, give her a certificate of divorce. What did Jesus say? Except for sexual immorality. That's right. Yeah, basically no divorce. When you marry a woman, you sign up for life. And there's a commitment there that you make. In other words, marriage is sacred. Treat it as sacred. And let your marriage display the unity between a man and a woman that God intends it ought to be, dating all the way back to Genesis 2. What about promises? He talks about oaths or swearing, but what's the underlying message? Always talk about swearing. Don't swear by the temple. Don't swear by this or that. What's the message he's getting across there? Don't swear at all. Instead, what? Let your yes be yes and your no, no. Be honest in your dealings with one another. Why is that a big deal? In your relations with people, do you like it when people are dishonest with you? Tell you one thing and do something else? You want people to treat you honestly, right? Jesus says, you treat other people honestly. What you say is what you mean. Your yes is yes, your no is no. And you don't have to swear to anything because you are a person of your word. And people will learn in dealing with you that what you say is what they're going to get. You're honest and above board. And for people in that day and time, that frankly was unusual. He goes on and talks about a spirit of forgiveness. When somebody hurts you or demeans you or takes advantage of you in some way, what's the natural human reaction? Get back. You get even with them somehow. And what did Jesus say? Turn the other cheek. Shrug it off. Don't dwell on it. If somebody makes you go 1 mile, you just go 2 with him. Kill him with kindness. And then the last thing in that chapter is, you've heard that it is said, you shall love your enemies and hate your neighbors. Okay, right there, what are you doing to all of humanity? You're making a distinction in humanity between 2 groups. What are they?
Love your enemy and don't get mad at them just because they made you mad.
That's the way it's supposed to be, right? But the way that the common perception that people had in that day was you love your neighbor and you hate your enemy. Well, before you can decide whether you love or hate somebody, what do you have to do? You have to categorize people. And so there's this little tiny clique over here that I call my friends, my neighbors. These are the people I like. These are the people I have something in common with. Everybody else is my enemy. I have no obligation to them. In fact, I can hate them if they deserve it. And Jesus just swept all of that away. He said, who do you love? Not just your neighbors, you love your enemies too. You love everybody. God's people, disciples of Christ, are to be instruments of unconditional love. Both to the people that they have something in common with, but even people they don't have something in common. Even their enemies are to be objects of their love. All right, so then when Jesus said, back in verses 14 through 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. What are the good works that he has in mind? How are these early disciples in the Jerusalem church, how are they treating one another? Love and kindness, forgiveness, with honesty. There is a caliber of humanity here being manifested in this early church that the people around them have just never seen before. They did not know it was possible for human beings to live like this, to coexist in this manner. And it is a fulfillment of exactly what Jesus said. Their light is shining, and the world around them is seeing it. And that is why, in these passages that we were just looking at earlier, that their neighbors were just looking on with awe and wonder at this community of believers. And in fact, to the point that many of them themselves were becoming believers. They were attracted to this. This is what humanity ought to be. And it made the rest of the world around them sit up and take notice. So that's why, I hope you're kind of getting a sense here of where we're going with this. That's why it's so important that when we're studying these one another obligations, we need to expand our view here and recognize this is not just about how we get along with one another. That's important. We talked about that last week. And there are some very major benefits that come from that internally. But this also impacts our influence on the world around us. People should be able to see, when they look inside and they see us, they ought to be wowed by what they see. There's something different about these people. And that's the question we have to ask ourselves. Do they actually see this? Press forward then, at the very end of his ministry in John chapter 13, meeting with his apostles the last time. He said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another, and by this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." We oftentimes speak of the marks of the New Testament church. You ever heard sermons about the identifying marks of the New Testament church? What's the one mark, identifying mark of the New Testament church that Jesus himself gave? Your love for each other. And if you don't have that, it doesn't matter what else you have. Whatever kind of marks you want to parade in front of the world, if they don't see us loving each other like we're supposed to, the rest of it is meaningless. Do you see what Jesus is saying here? This is huge. We ought to be living exemplars of what it means to love one another among ourselves, to the point that the world around us will look at us and say, I didn't know it was possible for people to live together like this, to have this kind of unconditional love for each other, but yet here are people who are doing it. The Apostle Paul, in his writings, sometimes address this subject. We'll just look at this one in Philippians chapter 2. Paul says, "Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God, without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world." That last line should sound familiar. It's an echo of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, right? That you shine as lights in the world. But notice how he begins this thought in the first part of verse 14. "Do all things without complaining and disputing." Now, what's that referring to? Okay. What's disputing and complaining? Or some versions may say grumbling. Where might you find grumbling and disputing, complaining in a congregational setting? Well, let me just put it bluntly. Have you ever been in a congregation that was characterized by a lot of grumbling and complaining and backbiting and bickering and stuff going on behind the scenes? Is it fun? Is that the way it's supposed to be? No. And so that's why Paul, he's writing to a group of Christians here, the church of Philippi, and he's begging these people, do everything without complaining and disputing. This is what is going to mark the difference between you and the people in the world. If a church is characterized by a lot of infighting, what's the incentive for people out in the world to want to come in and be part of that? I don't need that. I mean, I have that out in the world, right? There is no incentive. There is no attraction. There's nothing that would appeal to anybody to come in and be part of a group that is bickering and fighting and grumbling among themselves. If they're just a bunch of sourpusses, there's nothing attractive there. And so Paul says, okay, here's how you need to behave among yourselves. No complaining, no disputing, And the result is you're going to shine as lights in the world. This is how the world is going to know that you are my disciples. Because you figured out how to get along with one another. It's a secret the world hasn't figured out yet, and they never will figure it out, but you're my people. And I expect the best out of you in the way that you deal with one another. And at least on this score, the complaining and the disputing, get rid of that. Don't let that enter into your relationship with one another, and that's how you're going to influence the world. But really, for my money, the greatest example of this principle is found in a reading of the book of 1 Peter. I would encourage you to go home this evening and just read the 5 chapters of 1 Peter and notice how often Peter just harps on this. Actually, several of these passages came up in Sam's study over the last 3 months. Here are several of these one another obligations that Peter lays out for us. Love one another fervently with a pure heart. Be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Have fervent love for one, hospitable to one another. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another. Be submissive to one another. Greet one another. Are we beginning to see a theme here? I mean, Peter is he's just hammering on this. That you as the people of God have a special relationship with one another that just transforms the nature of your relationship. The people in the world don't see this in their relationships. But you're my people, and I expect you to be better about this. But notice what he says in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. He says, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God. Now, first, skim through that first verse, verse 9, and notice the language that he uses to describe the group. What's the terminology that he uses? Forget the modifiers, just the words that he uses to describe the group. Generation, priesthood, nation, people. Okay? Now, we won't take the time to break those down and assign different meanings and metaphors and so forth, but this is just the language that Peter is using to describe the fact that you're a special group now. You're a nation, you're a priesthood, you're a people, you're a generation, but now look at the modifiers attached to each one of those words. Chosen, what does that suggest? A chosen generation. Select, you've been handpicked for a certain purpose. Does that carry some kind of special meaning? Does that carry some kind of cachet to it? You've been handpicked. You've been chosen for a certain purpose. What kind of priesthood? A royal priesthood. It's not just any priesthood. This is a royal priesthood, a kingly priesthood. This is unique. This is special. This is different. What kind of nation are we? A holy nation, set apart. We're sacred. We're not like everybody else. There's something different about us. And then finally, people. What kind of people are we? We're special people. And then he ends it up in verse 10, we are the people of God. Yeah. So why does Peter waste all of this ink using to write out these different descriptors of who we are? And especially using the kind of language that he's using here. What's the message he's trying to impart to us? We are a people set apart, right? We ought to act like it. does our behavior, just among ourselves, the way that we get along with one another, does our behavior reflect these identifiers? Can people look at us, people from the outside, can they look inside and say, this is a special people? These people are different in a good way. We've never seen anything like this before. But it all ties back to the very thing that he has laid out throughout his epistle, and that is how we are fulfilling these responsibilities that we have toward one another. Are we doing that? Are we fervently loving one another? Are we having compassion for one another? Are we hospitable to one another? Are we ministering to one another? Are we submissive to one another? Are we greeting one another? You know, that's what I'm trying to do here is put a big exclamation mark on this whole series that Sam has presented over the last 3 months. Are we really serious about this? And not just in some generic fashion, yeah, we love everybody. No, look at the specifics. Look at the details of what that means. Are we really genuinely following through on all of this? Because this is going to make or break us as the people of God. This is going to define whether we're truly serious about this relationship or whether we're just play acting. But then keep going through the book of 1 Peter and notice something else that he draws here on at least a couple of occasions in the book, in chapter 2 and verse 12. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. People are watching us. We may not be aware of it. We may not appreciate the exposure that we have in the world. But people are watching us. And they're going to draw conclusions about us. And Peter says the conclusion they ought to draw is, even though they may badmouth you as evildoers, they're going to glorify God on the day of visitation. At some point in their lives, they're going to recognize this is what humanity should have been all along. And these are the few people who figured out how to do it. Disciples of Jesus. Are we conveying that message? Are we portraying that kind of evidence before the world in the way that we are dealing with one another? In chapter 3, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. I find it interesting in this passage that we tend to focus on the first part of that, be ready to give a defense, be ready to defend what we believe, and that's true, we should be ready, but who's initiating the conversation here? Read the rest of the verse. Who's initiating the conversation? Well, what does he say? Be ready to give a defense to who? Every man who does what? Who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. So I repeat, who's initiating the conversation here? Is it us? It's the outside world. They, on the outside, they look at us and the wheels are turning. They're trying to figure out, who are these people? Why are they the way they are? And they can't figure it out. And so at some point, some of them are going to be curious enough, they're going to come to us and ask a reason why we are the way we are. Why do we believe the things that we believe? Why do we live the way that we do? And in this context, why do we all get along so well together? We come from so many different, wildly different backgrounds in some cases, and yet there's a genuine love and compassion and hospitality among ourselves. How do you guys do it? And what does Peter say? Be ready to answer that question. And by the way, what is the answer to that question? It's because we have figured out the plan of salvation, and you don't have it. Is that the answer? Well, what is the answer, guys?
My answer to it is, don't just talk about it, do it, and show them what you want them to know.
Well, and that's the key, isn't it? We are living demonstrations of the teachings of Christ and how we are to get along with one another. All these things that we were talking about earlier, that Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, all of that should be displayed by our relationship with one another. And when people come in and they see us and our relationship with one another, they're just wowed. They've never seen this in any other group, but we have figured it out. Not because of any genius on our part, but because of the teachings of the one whom we follow. And that is what makes all the difference in the world. Okay, one more chart that we'll look at here. So externally, three things I'd like for us to consider. If we are doing the kind of job that we're supposed to be doing among ourselves, then it's going to have an external influence on those outside in three ways. Number one, it validates our identity as a people of God. We've talked about that. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So let's start showing what this reality of love is all about in our relationship with one another so people can know who we are as the people of God. It also makes the idea of God more appealing. We saw this in the early Jerusalem church. This is why the church grew fantastically in those early days, not so much because of the intellectual arguments that Peter was making, as it was the kind of community that these early disciples had managed to create among themselves. There's something different about these people that attracted the outsiders to want to be a part of that. And so that's a question we have to ask ourselves. Are we providing that kind of a model among ourselves that would attract others? And then, of course, finally, and this logically follows, that we're doing the first two, then how we're doing in our one another obligations is going to empower our evangelism. We're going to have something the world wants. Again, it's not because of any brilliance on our part. We're just following what the Master placed before us. We're living out what he wants us to be in our relationships with one another. And people are going to see that and want to be part of it. This chart we looked at in conclusion last week. If I am committed to living out these one another responsibilities, it's going to have an influence, an impact internally within the group. And so each one of us needs to pose these three questions. How is my commitment impacting my personal growth? Am I growing personally, individually, in my faith? If not, first question you need to ask is, am I really taking these one another obligations seriously? Or perhaps blame needs to kind of be shared around the rest of the group. Are other people helping me to grow? Maybe all of us need to examine ourselves and how we're doing on that score. How is my commitment to these one another responsibilities affecting my relationships with fellow Christians? If there's somebody within the group that I'm on the outs with, that I just frankly don't enjoy talking to and I try to avoid them, is that healthy for the group? No. No, that's a cancer. That's just going to eat away at the health and vitality of the church. So my relationships with my fellow Christians ought to be healthy, positive, supportive, and if they're not, I need to get busy and work on it. How is my commitment to these one another duties contributing to group cohesion? You know, I think one of the big problems that we have sometimes is that we tend to speak of the church in terms of they, the leadership. They need to understand this. They need to do a better job of this. If they would get their act together, then this group would be doing so much better. What's the problem with that? Yeah, that's often, yeah.
First of all, where do people that have that now that saying that have the right to say something about something that they're not doing? Could they do better?
Okay. The very terminology, they and we, what does that suggest? There's a separation involved, and that's not good. There's no group cohesion there. You know, everything that we say and do, it ought to be in the context of we. We need to do this. We need to do that. Things are not maybe as balanced or whatever as they ought to be. Well, what can we do to fix that? Once we start using the terminology of they need to do this, they need to fix that, the cohesion is gone. We're not a single organic body working toward a common goal anymore, and that needs to be fixed. So be thinking along those terms with regard to your individual responsibilities. But now let's apply the same challenges to the influence that we have out in the world. Number one, how is my commitment to these one another obligations affecting my attitude toward life? Now, what's that got to do with anything? Think through this. If you're the kind of person who is grumpy, you're a negative Nancy all the time, you're always finding something to complain about, and you're not bashful about expressing it, is that kind of attitude confined to the church? More than likely, what kind of person are you out in the world, in your workplace, in your interactions with people out there? What kind of person are you probably out there? You're probably the same kind of person there. What does that tell the people out there about your religion? There's nothing attractive to that, is there? If you're a member of that church and you're the kind of person that church produces, I don't want anything to do with that. There's nothing attractive about that. So pose this question to yourself. How is my commitment to these one another responsibilities? Remember, one of them is do not grumble against one another. Does my religion give me the kind of cheerfulness, optimism, a positive outlook on life that exudes a spirit that the people out in the world appreciate, that in fact they envy? I wish I had that kind of upbeat outlook on life.
The way I've always thought about that is, don't talk to me about it, show me.
And in this case, it's show a positive attitude, right? The spirit of optimism, cheerfulness. How is my commitment impacting my outside relationships? Again, if I'm having problems loving people inside the group, what kind of problem am I going to have loving people outside the group? Probably going to have the same problems, if not worse, yeah. So actually, what we're saying here is that how I am interacting with the people within the group, maintaining positive relationships within the group, that's probably going to be a mirror of the kind of relationships I'm having out in the world. Hopefully, it's a good thing. How is my commitment to these one another obligations making a mark in the world? Every one of us, whether we realize it or not, we, by the things that we say, the things that we do, about the attitude that we carry ourselves with as we go about our daily activities, we're leaving a mark on the world. Now, we can talk about the mark that we're leaving inside the church, but it spills over into the world and our relationship with the world. Is the world going to be a better place or a darker place because I lived in it? Have you ever posed that question to yourself? When I finally am dead and gone, will the world be a better place or a darker place because I lived in it? Think about that. And the answer to that question is pretty much wrapped up in how you're fulfilling these one another obligations, both within the church and then how that filters out into the world. Okay, that is all I had to go over tonight. Anybody have any additional thoughts or comments, observations? Next week, Sam will start a new series of classes on the book of Ecclesiastes. I wish I could say I'm looking forward to that, but I'm going to be teaching one of the kids' classes, so I won't be in here then. Okay, thank you very much.